Hey, hello everybody, and welcome to the last Animals and Society colloquium of the 2024-25 academic year. We do a colloquium about every month between September and May, and then we pause for the summer, so we keep it on an academic schedule. This is a great talk to end this semester, but I'm going to have Ken in a minute introduce the talk. Before we go to today's talk, I do want to make an announcement that today is the last talk we will be co-hosting with the Animals and Society Institute. For those of you who don't know the history of this colloquium series, we've been around for a few years. The Animals and Society section of the American Sociological Association decided to start this colloquium series, and very soon after that, we started working with the Animals and Society Institute, ASI, in order to make this series reach more people and have a more diverse and broader range of speakers in it. It has been a wonderful partnership. We are only ending it because ASI is no longer going to be in an organization, but they were kind enough to introduce us to Culture and Animals Foundation, who will take over the partnership in the fall, and you'll get to meet them in September. So what I would like to do now is turn things over to Ken Shapiro of ASI to tell you a little bit about this shift and then to introduce our speaker for today.
Thank you, Carol. Yeah, it's been a pleasure working with you. I think your first colloquium was way back in October of 21. I think we joined you shortly thereafter. But yeah, just an opportunity to say to folks what's going on with ASI. We've been announcing it, and we will continue to announce our progress in closing our doors, which involves really trying to find homes for our various projects, and we've been very fortunate and successful in that so far. We'll keep you posted on that. As Carol mentioned, this colloquium will now be taken over with the partnership of Culture and Animals Foundation. We also have been able to transfer our Human Animal Studies report, which I think is a nice go-to place to find out information about what's going on in the field, publications, colloquia, grants, etc. We are also negotiating with several universities to transfer or rehome our several journals, Society of Animals, Journal of Applied Animal Welfare Science, Sloth, which you may not know about, is an undergraduate journal. We also were very instrumental in getting Animal History started, which just had their first issue a couple of months ago. We also have had a summer institute for a number of years, and I think, Amy, you were in one of the first ones. Was it '08 maybe, something like that? And so it's great to see you still very, very much involved and contributing to the field so fully. We also are trying to get our Defining Animals video series transferred, and we hope that will happen. So that's a sort of a keyword 5-minute thing by a number of scholars in the field looking at some of the major concepts in the field. So we're saddened by the closing, but at the same time, we feel grateful that the primary project of developing the field of human animal studies has taken off so well and is really way beyond expectations. We're also very pleased with the progress of our Anacare, which is a treatment approach for a psychotherapy treatment approach for people who abuse animals, something that you, Amy, have been very involved in from the outset. We now have a partnership with the University of Tennessee's new Center for Veterinary Social Work, and they will be taking over our new diversion program, which will be an online program for mostly people who are required by the judicial system to undertake some kind of psychoeducational program regarding their abuse or alleged abuse. So that's ASI. We will keep in touch. The website will stay open. We will officially close the doors at the end of the year, but we'll continue with particularly listing the rehoming links on our website. So, Amy, great to see you again. And I remember way back when when you presented, I think you presented on there was some kind of pet food scare, and you presented on the media coverage of that. But in your dissertation, you actually were involved still already in the link, human violence, animal abuse connection. Um, oh yeah, you did. I think the study was on slaughterhouses and those folks you looked at counties where there were slaughterhouses and found an association between increased various crimes and were able to tease out that the fact of the violent desensitizing act of slaughtering animals itself was a contributing factor to increased crime rates. So very good. Uh, Currently, Amy is a full professor at the Department of Sociology and Criminology. Um, she's currently working on 3 grant-funded projects. Hopefully, all of them are still in place. Uh, and that's it. I will let you take it from there.
Okay, thanks, Ken. I appreciate that introduction. I'm really impressed by your memory of
Well, believe me,
different projects.
not memory. I looked up all these things, please.
Okay, okay. Well, you made it sound like it was off the top of your head, so well done. So hello, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. And as would be fitting, one of my cats has appeared and is chatting away next to me. So I hope she doesn't disrupt it too much. So I hope, Ken, can you see the PowerPoint okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so I will jump right in. And if you have questions, if you want to put them in the chat, and then we'll have time at the end to address the questions. So I'm going to be focusing in this presentation on research I've done on the connection between animal abuse and intimate partner violence specifically. So I'm going to try to give you an overview of where the research kind of began and where it is currently. But admittedly, it's a partial picture because I'm focusing on the work that we've done. Before I get started, I wanted to acknowledge the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada for continuing funding. And thankfully, Ken, no worries. My grants aren't in risk of being canceled because I'm in Canada, so grateful for that. The University of Windsor for funding my internal research chair, my wonderful colleagues at the Animal and Interpersonal Abuse Research Group at the University of Windsor, who have worked with me on this project and others. Also, the Brooks McCormick Animal Law and Policy program at Harvard for hosting me as a visiting fellow twice. And also, thank you for the invitation to speak. I really appreciate it. And I wanted to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which includes the Ojibwa, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi. So here's an overview of the presentation. I'm going to start with just a brief description, an explanation of how I became interested in this area of research, some work that we've done with domestic violence shelter samples, then community samples, and moving into kind of the good news, I guess, if you can say there's any good news associated with any of this, around the policy and legislative responses. And then I'll wrap up by talking about some recent case law. So I thought I would start with a discussion of where it began, why I became interested in this area of research. It started a long time ago. I, as an undergrad, was volunteering at a no-kill cat shelter. And one of my jobs there was to complete the paperwork when people would surrender cats. And one of the patterns that I was noticing was that there were a number of women who were coming to give up their cats for various reasons, saying things like their boyfriend was threatening to get rid of the cat, or they were being forced to get rid of the cat. their cats were being abused. And so as an undergrad, I thought, oh, it was all very jarring. And I wondered, is it an anomaly, or is this part of a broader pattern that I just wasn't aware of? Um, and sadly, I began to realize that it wasn't an anomaly. And as I dug into the literature, as a graduate student, started to realize that there were a number of studies that had been conducted on the connection between animal abuse and intimate partner violence specifically. So I was fortunate that after an undergrad, and in this picture, I'm not an undergrad. This picture was taken a few months ago with my son and I socializing some kittens, although it looks like they're socializing us here in this picture. But I was fortunate that I went to grad school at MSU, and Linda Kaloff and Tom Dietz joined the faculty there in the Department of Sociology and encouraged me to do the research I was interested in. So I was able to continue research looking at all kinds of animal issues. And this is an area where I keep coming back to. As Ken mentioned, my dissertation was in a related but different area. But throughout my career, I keep coming back to this relationship between animal abuse and intimate partner violence because I think it's really important, and there's so much work left to do. So I dove into the literature, and I realized that, in the 90s, Carol Adams was talking about the relationship between animal abuse and intimate partner violence and ways that abusers would harm animals as a way to kind of get at or further abuse their human victims. And Frank Ascioni in the mid to late 90s conducted a few studies looking at this relationship and assessing empirically what this relationship looked like. And not surprisingly, at the early point in the research, the numbers for co-occurrence, the proportion of co-occurrence when domestic violence shelter samples were used was kind of all over the place. Like it ranged from as low as 25% to 80% of women who were surveyed in a domestic violence shelter reported their partner had also abused their pets. So one of the things that my colleague Betty Barrett and I applied for a SSHRC grant, and we were fortunate enough to receive the funds. And then we had a great PhD student join our team, Rochelle Stevenson. And we were able to conduct a study in Canada across 17 different domestic violence shelters. And one of the things that we did in that study was to see if we could come up with an instrument for measuring this form of abuse that could be used across studies, because we found that people were asking different questions, like, has your partner physically abused your pet? Yes or no? Has your partner threatened and or abused your pet? So things were kind of getting grouped in together. So we created the Partners Treatment of Animals scale. And we came up with, through factor analysis, a number of subscales for the way that animals are harmed by abusive partners: emotional abuse, threats to harm, neglect, physical abuse, and then severe physical abuse. And so we were able to kind of distill the questions down to 21 questions to tap into these various forms of abuse. And using this measure, we found in our sample of domestic violence shelters that 89% of the participants reported that their abuser had mistreated their pets. Now, to date, there have been a number of other studies in other countries, such as Nick Taylor's great work in Australia and the UK. And increasingly, our instrument here, the PTAS, is being translated into other languages, which I'm happy to see that it's being used, and it's we think quite useful so then we can compare across studies. So the co-occurrence is only part of the story. We've also found, and other studies have found, that animal abuse is statistically significantly related to controlling behavior and also severe forms of intimate partner violence, like severe physical abuse. We've also found that animal abuse and the presence of animals impacts help seeking. So in our sample, we found that 56% of our participants reported they delayed leaving because of concern for their companion animals. Because unfortunately, most shelters at that time didn't have programs in place to help with companion animals. Fortunately, this is improving. And I'll touch on a study that we did looking at what programs are available in Canada and the US. So unfortunately, people are making decisions about whether or not to stay in abusive relationships based on what will happen to their pets or their companion animals. We also surveyed staff in the shelters, and unfortunately found that 3/4 were aware of women who had refused to go to the shelter specifically because of their companion animal, which is really troubling. So not only are people reporting they're delaying going to shelter, but that there's this whole other group of people who will not go to shelter specifically because they can't take their pets with them. And Crystal Giesbrecht's recent research with interviews with shelter staff has, a number of really sad stories about staff recounting women refusing to go to the shelter and saying they'd rather live in their car and be unhoused than go to the shelter without their companion animal. So why is this the case? Well, the most dominant explanation in the literature, and one that Carol Adams was talking about years ago, is that the harm of pets is instrumentalized to harm people. And when we assessed, we included measures of intentionality and motivation to assess how the human victims and survivors perceived the abuse. And we found that they quite often understood emotional abuse, threats against the pets, and neglect as being motivated by a desire to harm them themselves. But what we were somewhat surprised by was that the explanatory power of the predictors for physical animal abuse was weaker. So why is that the case? We don't know. We're conducting research right now that we're hoping will help shine light on this. One of the possible explanations is that we're looking at different types of abusers here, that maybe those motivated by jealousy are more likely to abuse in emotional threats and neglectful ways, whereas those who are more social, generally antisocial, might be more likely to engage in physical animal abuse. So this is something that, we need further research to kind of shed light on why this is the case. So one of the critiques of our research and other shelter-based studies is that, well, maybe we're overstating the problem. Maybe this is just a phenomenon that is occurring within domestic violence shelter samples, and it's not generalizable to, other people who aren't in shelters. So fair enough. Acknowledging that, we sought to use a broader sample, a community-based sample, and we're able to get a question added to the Canadian General Social Survey about animal maltreatment. And what we found was that those with a companion animal who reported no animal maltreatment, only 4% reported physical intimate partner violence, whereas 50% of those who reported animal maltreatment also reported physical intimate partner violence. And these were statistically controlled, statistically significant differences. And we also found that animal maltreatment in this community sample, so, the general public, when we controlled for sociodemographic factors, we found that there is a 16% increased probability of injury and 25% increased probability of reporting fearing for one's life if their companion animal is harmed or threatened. So it's, it provides further evidence that this isn't just a phenomenon within domestic violence shelters. People in the general community are experiencing it as well. So it's certainly a broader problem than just domestic violence shelters. So our current research, so we conducted, we realized the one question we were able to get added to the GSS wasn't sufficient. That's all they would let us add, unfortunately. So we decided we were going to conduct our own study using a community sample where we could ask all the questions that we wanted from our PTAS, our Partners Treatment of Animals scale. And here's how it broke down. So remember earlier I showed you the PTAS with the shelter sample, and we had 5 subscales. With the community sample, we have 4. So emotional abuse and minor physical abuse are grouped together, and then neglect is separate, getting rid of pets, and severe physical and sexual abuse were, based on the factor analysis, separated into different subscales. And this is with a sample of 882 self-identified women in the community with partners who identified as men. And here's a breakdown of the proportion who were reporting animal abuse in the form of the PTAS questions and IPV, or intimate partner violence. So as you can see here, approximately 29% report no animal abuse and no intimate partner violence or controlling behaviors. 30% report both. And to me, what's interesting is at the bottom here, 39% report, yes, they experienced intimate partner violence, but there was no animal abuse. But only 2% report there was animal abuse, but no intimate partner violence. So overall, 43% of those who report intimate partner violence also reported animal abuse. And of those who reported animal abuse, 93% report intimate partner violence. So I don't like the term red flag because it instrumentalizes animals. But as you can see here, using a community sample, paying attention to animal abuse could help to identify instances of intimate partner violence. And again, I want to emphasize this is a community sample. So individuals who are in these relationships who have not sought the assistance of domestic violence shelters. And we're currently analyzing the data on the severity variables, how it impacts help seeking, and other aspects like area of residence, rural versus urban, etc. So stay tuned for those results. We're currently working our way through all the data that we have. So all of that is, admittedly bad news. You have forms of violence that are connected. The good news is that we're seeing responses in the form of social policy and legal responses based on the research, which is wonderful. And sorry, my cat's going on and on here. We collaborated with Red Rover, which is a charitable organization in the US, and we were able to secure some funding from Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada to contact every domestic violence shelter in Canada and the US to see what pet programs were available on and off site. And what we found, and the articles are currently being published, what we found was good news. There's an increasing number of programs, and we were able to use the data to create a searchable database so that individuals who are looking to go to a domestic violence shelter can look to see what programs are available in their community and any restrictions, like, some have restrictions on the size of animal that you can bring, etc. So happy to report that an increasing number of shelters have programs, but there's still a lot of work left to be done. And I'll talk about some of the barriers to that shortly. The legislative responses have also been quite positive in Canada and the US. And I'll touch on just a few of them, but there are others that if I had time, I would go into. In British Columbia, the changes to the Family Law Act in 20, let me see, it just went into effect, I believe, last year, but I could be mistaken. Directs the court to take the best interests of animals into account in determining custody. And one of the factors that's specifically laid out in the legislation is that there has to be a consideration given to a history of family violence or a risk of family violence and or threats to the animals in the home, which is a really positive development. Additionally, in our Federal Divorce Act, judges are required to consider family violence in the family court cases. And importantly, the definition of family violence now includes harm to animals as part of it, which is great. Bill C3, an act to amend the Judges Act in the Canadian Criminal Code. My colleague Betty Barrett and I provided testimony to a committee of Senate about this bill, and were able to get an observation added to include training for judges on the connection between animal abuse and intimate partner violence and sexual violence. In the US, kudos to you, those of you in the US, because you have the US Pet and Women's Safety Act that was passed, which did a number of things, but a couple things that I'll mention here is, one, importantly, it created a grant fund that organizations can apply to develop programs to shelter animals when their humans are searching for help from domestic violence, which is great. And it's been funded at $2 to $2.5 million per year, which is vitally important. This is something I've been urging here in Canada, because we really can't just put the onus on domestic violence shelters that are so underfunded to say, hey, here's another problem, you know, can you develop programs to address this? This funding really helps. The PAWS Act also recommended that states in the US that hadn't amended their protection order statutes to make it possible to include animals do so. So that recommendation was in there, which is really vitally important. And I'll talk shortly about the value of these protection order statutes. But one thing I want to mention is that and this study is going to be published shortly, we analyzed the jurisdictions where there are animal inclusive protection order statutes and what shelter programs are available. And unfortunately, we found that jurisdictions where you can include an animal in a protection order are actually less likely to have shelters, domestic violence shelters, where there's programming for companion animals. So we argue that this is a form of policy slippage, where policies are implemented, perhaps, you know, with good intentions, but if proper funding isn't provided for the programs that are going to help people, the policies aren't going to have their full effect. All right, so protection order statutes. I'm going to move in to talk about some recent research I've been doing focused specifically on these statutes. And the first thing I want to highlight is that previously it was difficult to, if not impossible, to include an animal in a protection order statute, because it wasn't specified in the statutes that they could be included. And because animals are legally considered property, there wasn't an easy way to get them included in protection order statutes. Now, given the research that, you know, I talked about earlier that we've done and others have done, it's clear now that there is a connection between animal abuse and intimate partner violence. And if you want to help the people, you need to account for the animals as well. And one way to do this is through protection order statutes that allow you to include animals. So there are currently 41 states in the US where you can include an animal in a protection order statute. And unfortunately, only 2 Canadian provinces. So again, this is an area where we have a lot of work to do here in Canada. So as I mentioned, in the past few years, I've been focusing on these protection order statute changes to see, okay, what's the value in these changes, and what are the implications for the human and animal victims? And so one of the studies that I have conducted recently was to analyze the case law where these protection order statutes have been cited. And I should take a step back and say, like, these changes to these protection order statutes are relatively recent. I think the first one appeared in 2003, but it wasn't until the past 7 years or so where we really saw kind of a dramatic increase in states amending their protection order statutes so that you can explicitly include animals. So in this study, I wanted to see, okay, is there value to these protection order statutes as far as helping to mitigate the impacts of coercive control? Because what we're finding is that coercive control in particular is an insidious form of intimate partner violence that tends not to get as much attention because it's based more on a course of conduct than just an specific incident of physical abuse. So it's harder for the criminal justice system to address. And the research is pointing out that protection orders, given the limitations of the criminal justice system, protection orders are one useful way of addressing coercive control. So I wanted to see, is the inclusion of animals helping address coercive control? And how are the courts dealing with these inclusions? Are they taking it seriously? And I'm happy to report that based on my analysis, they are taking it seriously. So here are the main themes from the analysis. And this article was just published, like, literally, I think last week. So in the judgments, and I analyzed, there were 38 judgments that I analyzed. In 12 of those, the courts explicitly described and interpreted animal abuse and intimate partner violence as being connected. So for instance, there was one case where a father was denied custody because he had abused the animals. And the court said, because of this connection, this is reasonable, and the animal needs to be included in the protection order. Also, I found 11 cases where animal abuse was cited specifically as grounds for evidence for why a protection order is warranted, which is really important because, as I mentioned, coercive control in particular can be hard to get the system to pay attention to because it tends to be more focused on specific incidents of physical abuse. But the inclusion of animals in protection orders really kind of expands the evidence that the court can do to look and say, okay, there is a course of conduct here of abusive behavior that's extending to those around the specific victim, extending to their companion animals, and in some cases, other family members. So the role of protection orders in mitigating coercive control was really evident in these judgments. And there were several instances where the ability to include an animal in a protection order was actually specifically cited as enabling the court to take harm and threats beyond the individual human victim into account. So for instance, there was one case where an abuser pointed a gun at his wife's aunt. The wife wasn't home. And the courts were reluctant to include the aunt in a protection order. But then they turned to the protection order statute where you can include animals and said, well, if animals can be included, companion animals can be included, then it stands to reason that extended family should be able to be included in a protection order as well, which was a significant, development. Also, there were 7 cases that I identified where the defendant specifically appealed the inclusion of the animal in the protection order. So as I argue in the paper, this just goes to show that these animals are significant tools, if you will, in the perpetration of intimate partner violence and coercive control. Because why go through the time of appealing the inclusion of an animal in a protection order, right? Unless there's really something there that you want to hold on to, right? The ability to control the situation in that way. And I found that in only one of the cases was the appeal granted. And in that case, it was the only instance I found where non-traditional animals were included in a protection order. It was kangaroos and camels, if I recall correctly, because this couple had a petting zoo. And so the court ruled that they were deemed agricultural animals and outside of the protection of a protection order. So in the article, I write about, my recommendations and ways to tighten up these loopholes. There was also one case where the animal inclusive protection order was cited as relevant to a habeas corpus application. And you might be thinking, okay, well, is this an anomaly? And I'll talk a bit about why it's not shortly. But in this case, a writ of habeas corpus was brought. So it's a determination of whether or not someone's being wrongfully imprisoned, brought on behalf of a woman who killed her allegedly abusive boyfriend in the 90s. At that time, the expert witness didn't include and wasn't allowed to include animal abuse in her assessment. But then subsequent to that, given the development in the research on animal abuse, they appealed, and the expert witness said his convictions for animal abuse were relevant and should be taken into consideration. The appeal was granted. However, the state then appealed, and the state argued that because animal abuse wasn't included in the definition of intimate partner violence, it should be excluded. And so the defendant in the case remained incarcerated as a result. Now, what's interesting in this case is that a few years later, this was in the state of California, animal abuse was added to the definition of intimate partner violence. So that case wasn't an anomaly. There are other cases where women have killed their accused perpetrators. And this was a case that I was here in Canada and British Columbia that I was asked to consult on as an expert witness and provide testimony. And I don't have time to go into the specifics of the case. But very quick overview, the defendant was accused of killing her abuser, charged with first-degree murder. The precipitating incident was that he choked her cat. And so after he went to sleep, she killed him. So I reviewed 1,000 pages of documents, and in my report and in my testimony, I argued that the Crown, so the prosecution, was arguing that the choking of the cat wasn't relevant, right? It was outside of the context of the alleged abuse. But I argued that based on the research, it was part of the abuse and an extension of her abuse. So she was convicted instead of first-degree murder. She was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced. And this is another area where I'm conducting further research to see, okay, are there other cases where animal abuse is relevant, but perhaps being excluded as evidence, like in the previous case I mentioned, because historically animal abuse wasn't considered and included as part of a definition of intimate partner violence. So another part of the protection order statutes that I'm interested in has to do with the animals themselves. So can it,
Amy, I'm going to interrupt you
yeah,
quickly just to say if we could wrap up in about 5 minutes so we'd have a little bit of time for Q&A at the end.
yep, no problem. I'm wrapping it up, I promise. So, so on the animal side of things, the protection orders are also helping. I published an article where I looked at what the protection orders allow you to do for the animals. Alaska, I've given you an example here, really stands out because not only can you remove an animal even if the abuser legally owns the animal, even if there's no evidence of animal abuse, but the abuser can be ordered to pay support for that animal. So it's interesting because we're in my analysis, I charted how we're seeing a move from animals being viewed as more than property. And 8 statutes in the US now have moved away from that property designation because of the need to protect animals and people, and it's harder to do with their property. So the last thing I want to talk about is the current paper that is under review, and I'll just say a bit about. So I wanted to see, are these protection order statutes being cited in the case law in ways that might help animals above and beyond the context of intimate partner violence? And the findings indicate that they are. So here were my 3 research questions, and there were 12 cases that were citing the protection order statutes where you can include animals. And in all of the cases, the courts implicitly or explicitly cited these protection order statutes as evidence that the status of animals is shifting away from property in society. And in 9 of them, they use the protection order statutes to reason that legal categories that used to be reserved for people now are being extended to animals, things like victimhood and being a protected party. So how are these arguments being received and interpreted by the courts? The evidence is mixed. There was one case where the court used the fact that animals had been included in protection order statutes as evidence that when the legislature wants to protect animals, they do so. So if they're not mentioned in law, then the legislature must not, be willing to introduce them into consideration. And in another case, there was, fear of opening the floodgates to litigation that was cited. But what I want to leave you with are 4 cases where I think there are interesting findings that, I plan to follow up on to see if this trend continues. A protection order statute was used to extend the emergency aid exemption to animals. So being able to attend someone's property without a search warrant. And also in this case, which was a custody case, the court cited that the protection order statute points to ways that areas that were once reserved for people are now being extended to animals, such as being protected parties. And this one here, which was witnessing wrongful death of a companion animal, I highlighted the important part at the bottom. They write the only other family relationship for which judges are explicitly empowered to provide protection other than any animal kept or held by the applicant. So that's the language from the protection order statute, is that of the applicant's dependent children. And then this one, question of whether or not animals are part of automatic orders as property in the case of relationship dissolution. And the court said specifically, because it's not citing the protection order statute, it's not the intention of the legislature to continue to treat animals as property or chattel. So I think these are pretty interesting ways that the protection order statutes are being taken up. So to wrap it up, there's a strong connection between animal abuse and intimate partner violence. Unfortunately, animals are vulnerable to abuse within the home, especially if there's coercive control. The good news, the research is impacting policy, which is helping people and animals. And I think efforts aimed at mitigating the impact of these forms of abuse in the form of protection order statutes might also be helpful in redressing a larger and more pernicious problem for animals, which, has been of interest to animal advocates for, centuries, really, is their legal status as property, because these protection order statutes are being used in interesting ways to demonstrate that companion animals are not necessarily clearly property the way they used to be, and that our societal views on them are shifting, and maybe the legal system needs to as well. So that is it. Thank you for your time and attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fitzgerald, for all of that. That's a lot of information, and it's so impressive the body of work and the amount that you've contributed to this really important topic. I'd like to open it up now to everybody for questions. You can use the hand raise signal if you would like, and I will call on you. Or if you would like, you can go ahead and put your questions directly into the chat. We have one person with their hand raised right now, Falvi.
Hello, and sorry, and greetings from the UK, where I thoroughly enjoyed your talk, Amy. Um, I'm I'm a senior lecturer at the vet school at the University of Bristol. My world is more livestock and working animals, and actually, and your presentation's given me a lot of food for thought. At the moment, we're thinking about starting some research on the link between animal health emergencies and interventions to control outbreaks in livestock and potential increased gender-based violence and domestic abuse in farming communities in the UK. I think that issue has remained largely ignored in both research and policy, not only in the UK, but globally. I was wondering if, as part of your research, which I know focus on pets and companion animals, whether you have also seen in more rural settings and communities, whether there are also similar patterns and links that can be made between abuse and poor welfare and neglect of livestock and working animals, and also gender-based violence and intimate partner violence. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's a great question. Yes, it's less commonly reported, but we have had a number of participants in our studies that do report that the animals that they're concerned about are non-traditional companion animals, so like farmed animals. And in some cases, the animals aren't necessarily being farmed for industry, but instead are, being farmed for, the domestic home. What's interesting in those cases is that it complicates it even further, right? Because, as I mentioned, a number of shelters now in Canada and the US will allow you to bring companion animals to shelter or have a foster-based program, at least. But it's much more challenging when there are large animals, farmed animals, horses, things like that. So it poses a number of challenges. One way that a number of the shelters that I've spoken with are dealing with it is they're using foster-based programs. And so they're asking farmers to volunteer. And they've reported to me that they've gotten quite a bit of uptake from people who are willing to volunteer to shelter, horses in their barns or goats and, other non-traditional animals that people are, nonetheless concerned about. I've also had a case where a victim contacted me and she had two animals that would be considered wildlife that her abuser was threatening to expose, that she had these wildlife animals that she had rehabbed but couldn't be released. And he was using that to keep her in the abusive relationship. So unfortunately, it's not not just a companion animal issue. It runs the gamut of any animal basically that people form relationships with are at risk. So you're definitely I'm glad to hear that you're taking that into consideration in your research, because I think it's really important.
Thank you.
We have a couple questions from one person in the chat. I'm going to start with the one question from them. Just leave time for other people if other people have questions. One question is, can animal abuse be motivated by revenge, meaning it would be a rapid or impulsive form of violence and end shortly after?
That's also a good question. So what we've found is that, and I alluded to it a bit earlier when I talked about the possibility that there are different subtypes of abusers, and that animal abuse is factoring into, their abuse in different ways. It's possible that there are some cases where the abuser is motivated by more long-standing issues like jealousy, control, things like that, where the animal abuse might be, longer term. But there could be cases of abusers who fall into that more like antisocial grouping of abusers, where the abuse could be very short-lived and kind of seem episodic, and could be, motivated by things like revenge. In another study we did, which I didn't go into, we looked at animal abuse as part of harassment and stalking behavior. And we actually found that the most likely perpetrator wasn't the intimate partner. When animals are involved, the most likely perpetrator is actually a neighbor, which is interesting. So that could also speak to some of that revenge type of motivation, that can manifest in some cases. So good question.
Thank you. And that person had one more question, but we don't have much time, so I do want to open it up if there's anyone else who wanted to ask a question. I'll give just a couple seconds. Yes, it looks like someone was typing one out. Oh, nope, that's not a question. So if no one else has a question, I will read this other question. Okay. If pets in contemporary times differ from those in the past, who were primarily associated with tasks, is there a historical connection between pet abuse and partner violence?
That's also a really good question. I think there is, like, I think part of what we're seeing is probably increasing awareness, but I think as people form closer bonds with companion animals, which we've seen over time, it just becomes, not only do more people have companion animals, but the reported bonds that they feel with them are stronger. I think this problem is only going to become worse, which is something that, when I'm talking to policymakers, I try to emphasize, like, we really need to deal with this, because the situation's not going to get better. It's going to get worse, because people are forming closer attachments to animals, and that puts those animals at risk. It puts the people at risk too. There haven't, to my knowledge, and this is something that we're thinking about doing at APARC, to my knowledge, there haven't been any analyses over time to see if these relationships are changing over time. But that's something that we've talked about doing, because now we have longer term data than prior. So it's possible that we could at least do something, within like a 10 to 15 year time span to see if it's changing.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. I have one I really want to ask. So I'm gonna hope there's time for two. One person is wanting to know if there's any citations on forming closer bonds with animals. So Angie, you asked that. Amy and I will chat via email later, and if we can think of a few resources, we'll put them together and email them out when we email the video from this presentation. Ken asks, what are your views of the possible contribution of psychological interventions if and when they are shown to be effective? I presume this means for people who are committing abuse against intimate partners and companion animals.
Yeah, I would love to see most most batterer intervention programs still don't address animal maltreatment. Or if they do, it's often described as like the old power and control wheel where animals are included, but like right after destroying property. So they're kind of grouped with property, and that's limiting, that's problematic. I would love to see more inclusion of animals, but paying attention to not just the physical maltreatment, right? So, some of the intervention programs will speak to physical animal abuse and torture, but leave out the whole gamut of, threats, neglect, which are also quite impactful for the animals and the human victims. So I would love to see like more nuanced inclusion of animals in intervention programs, because like our I showed you the partners treatment of animal scale that we developed, and it really does demonstrate that we need to be paying attention and not just physical animal abuse, but also these other forms of maltreatment, the threats, the emotional abuse, the neglect, which can really have um, negative impacts for people and animals.
Thank you so much, Amy. We're almost at the end of the hour, so we're going to wrap up now. We have just about a minute left. So in that time, first, I would like to thank you so much, Amy, for being here, and thank all of our audience. We will be sending out alerts, however you found out about this, either through ASI or for ASA, when we have our fall lineup planned. Before we go, Amy, is there anything that you would like to say? I always like to give our speaker the last word.
I guess the one thing I would say is, if you, and I do this in all the talks I give, if you suspect that someone's in an abusive relationship and you're concerned, I would highly recommend offering to care for their companion animal if you're in a position to do so, or offer to help them find someone or an organization that can care for their animal, because unfortunately, just like we see with natural disasters, people will put the well-being of their animals ahead of their own sometimes. And so just making that simple offer can be life-saving for the people and the animals.
Thank you for that insight. And thank you so much, Dr. Fitzgerald, for all the wonderful work that you do. I know that it's a hard topic, but we need the work done. And so probably everyone in this room is grateful that you're helping and doing that work. With that, everyone, have a good afternoon. Thanks for being a part of our colloquium series this year, and we hope we see you again next year. If you have any ideas of things that would make a great colloquium talk, you're working on anything, just email me. My email is my name, carol.glasser@mnsu.edu. And hopefully I'll be hearing from some of you as we put together our fall lineup. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.